They beat her for her 3 babies, and the giant mountain man said, "You're coming with me." Hello, my dear friend. This is your narrator of Tales from the Wild West. Before we begin, make sure you are subscribed, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. I am sending you a warm hug tonight from a little western town that once tried to punish a woman for bringing too much life into a hard land. In 1885, Willow Ford was one dusty street pinned between the river and the low brown hills, a church at one end, a saloon at the other, a store in the middle, and a scatter of tired houses leaning away from the wind. Folks there knew about drought and failed corn and cattle dying in late snow. They knew how to bow their heads and keep going, but they still wanted someone to blame when the sky turned mean. That spring, they picked a 27-year-old ranch wife named Maggie Lane and the 3 tiny souls she brought into the world in a single stormy night. Maggie had never been called delicate. Not once. She was big-boned and broad-shouldered from years of hauling water, splitting kindling and dragging stubborn calves out of mud, with hands so strong she could wring out a whole line of wash before most women had finished half. She had married a ranch hand named Carl Jessup, and for 5 long years the cradle by their stove sat empty. 3 times she had carried hope, and 3 times she had followed a small pine box up the hill behind the church, coming down with her arms wrapped around nothing but her own ribs. Grief settled into her like winter cold, deep and quiet, and when her belly rose again that winter, she walked as if she was carrying glass and prayed under her breath while she worked that this one child would stay. On the night her time came, the wind howled around the little house and rain slapped the windows. The midwife laid both hands on that swollen belly, and her brow went tight as a drawn cinch. She muttered that there was more than 1, maybe 2, maybe 3, and Maggie felt fear and wonder twist together inside her. Before dawn, there were 3 babies crying at once in that narrow bed. 3 red faces, 3 sets of flailing fists, 2 girls and a boy, 3 warm weights tucked against her big, tired body. For a little while, the rest of the world fell away. She kissed damp foreheads, and counted fingers and toes, and whispered names into the dark, like a prayer finally answered. Then the door opened, and the rest of the world stepped in, whether she wanted it or not. Carl stood there in his shirt sleeves with his hair mussed, and whiskey still sharp on his breath, his mother tight behind him like a shadow made of hard opinions. They stared at the bed, as if she had dragged wolves under the quilt instead of children. The older woman crossed herself twice and said in a thin, sharp voice that 3 at once was not a blessing on land, this poor, that no small ranch could carry that many extra mouths, that the Lord did not send such a sign without a price attached. By noon, that talk had jumped from porch to porch like sparks in dry grass. Some said triplets meant a neighbor's child would be taken to even the count. Some said the herd would sicken. Some just liked the taste of a new kind of fear on their tongues. Carl soaked it all in at the saloon and came home with his shoulders tight and his eyes fixed on everything but the babies. Maggie sat up in bed with 1 child at her breast and the other 2 tucked into the crook of her arm, and tried to smile like nothing in the world was wrong. He started with low, bitter words about bad luck and ruined chances, about men who would not hire a hand whose house was cursed, and feed slipping away into 3 tiny mouths that had not even learned to swallow right. She had learned to live with words. They stung, but they did not break bone. Then his hand flashed out and caught her across the cheek so hard she heard a ringing in her ears and tasted blood. And before he was done, the lamp had rattled on the table, and the midwife in the next room had shut her eyes and prayed. When the house finally went quiet, she slid down to the floor beside the cradle, cheek already swelling, ribs aching every time she drew a breath. She wrapped both arms around that rough wooden box and the 3 swaddled bundles inside it like she was trying to hold back another storm, and she rocked them slow and whispered that they had done nothing wrong, that they were the only good thing in that house. At first light, a neighbor woman saw her hanging a crooked line of laundry, moving stiff, one eye darkening like a bruise-colored sunrise. And by mid-morning, Willow Ford knew that Maggie Lane had 3 newborns and a husband with fists quick enough to mark her on the same day those babies opened their eyes. The story rolled down the street to the livery, then out to the freight yard, and finally into the ears of a man who lived higher than all of them. A man named Jonah Hale, who trapped in the high country along Breakneck Ridge, a man so tall and broad they called him the Giant of the Mountain, and crossed the street rather than meet his eye. A man no one expected to hitch his team, ride down into town, look at a battered woman with 3 tiny babies in her arms, and say in a voice like distant thunder, "You're coming with me." Jonah Hale almost never came all the way into Willow Ford. Folks were used to seeing his wagon far off on the ridge road, a broad back and a pair of bay horses heading toward Breakneck Ridge and vanishing into the trees. Up close, he was bigger than any story, tall enough to look a man in the eye, while the man still stood on the boardwalk, chest and arms built by hard work instead of talk. People said he was dangerous. Mostly they meant he minded his own business and did not scare easy, and a town that liked to bully the weak had learned not to tug on a mountain lion's tail. That morning he tied his team in front of the store, and the street went quiet, without anyone saying why. He asked the storekeeper one question in a low voice. "Jessup Place." A nervous finger pointed down the lane. Jonah nodded once and walked that way, boots steady in the dust, as if he had started this trip in his heart a long time ago, and his body was only now catching up. The Jessup house leaned tired against the wind. The yard was bare dirt, the fence half fallen. On the front step, Maggie sat with a baby in each arm, and the third in a crate at her feet. 3 small faces tucked into thin blankets. One of her eyes had puffed near shut. A purple mark ran from her cheekbone up into her hair. She rocked a little, not enough to jostle her ribs, just enough to keep all 3 from crying at once. Jonah stopped at the low gate and took it in with one slow look. The bruises, the tremble in her big hands, the way she held herself like a horse that had been struck too many times. His jaw tightened, but when he spoke, his voice was slow and even. "Mrs. Lane," he said. "Name is Jonah Hale. I trap up on Breakneck." She had heard of him same as everyone. Half the town said he had killed a man up there. The other half said if he had, the man had needed killing. Seeing him now, she believed both might be true. "Yes, sir," she said, keeping her chin level though it hurt. "I know who you are." "Then you know I do not ride down here for gossip," he answered. "I heard you brought 3 babies into the world and got a beating for your trouble." One of the triplets kicked free and let out a thin wail. That great big man reached down with one careful finger and tucked the blanket back in place, gentle as a woman who had done it 1,000 times. "You're coming with me," he said. "You and all 3 of them." The words landed heavy as a stone. Maggie's arms tightened. "I cannot," she whispered. "This is my husband's house. His land, his kin. These are his children. I took vows in that church like any woman." Jonah's gaze slid to the dark bloom above her cheek. "And he took his vows with that same hand," he said quietly. "The one that laid you open not a week after you near died, bearing his young. I am not here to preach at you. I am here because I have a tight roof, meat enough for winter, and a room that stands empty. Up there, nobody will raise a hand against you for doing what God made you to do." The front door creaked. Carl Jessup stepped out, hair mussed, shirt half-buttoned, whiskey still sharp on his breath. He stopped when he saw Jonah filling his gate. "What business you got with my wife?" he snapped. "You think you can come down off that ridge and tell me how to run my house?" Jonah did not step back. He only turned his head and looked at Carl, the way a man looks at a stray dog too close to the meat barrel. "My business," he said, "is that your wife is sitting here bruised with 3 babes not 7 days old. My business is that you let fool talk of curses guide your hand. The rest of your sins are between you and the Lord." Carl gave a short, harsh laugh. "You planning to steal her?" he said. "Big mountain man and his wagon. Folks already say you killed a man up there. Maybe they will listen when I tell them you took my wife and my young ones too." A neighbor woman had stopped by her fence with a basket of washing. The livery boy stood in the road, staring. The town might not have loved Maggie, but it was listening now. Jonah pushed the gate open and stepped into the yard. The boards under his boots creaked once and stayed still. "You raise that talk," he said, voice still low. "And the first thing the preacher will ask is why your wife looks like she lost a fist fight in a house with a new cradle. Why 3 hungry babies lie wrapped in rags while you stand on the step smelling of drink. You want the elders in your parlor, Jessup, asking those questions in front of your kin." Carl's mouth opened, then shut. He was used to being the biggest man in his own yard. Next to Jonah, he looked like he had shrunk in the wash. His eyes slid away first. "She is my wife," he muttered. "She stays. They are my babies." Maggie heard the words and felt how empty they were. He had not once asked if they were warm or if she could stand. Jonah's gaze went back to her, and some of the hardness left his face. "I have a cabin big enough for 4, he said. "Snow comes early. The wind sings around it. It is not an easy place, but there is room and food and quiet. I hitch my team in 1 hour. I will not drag you, Maggie Lane, but I will not leave 3 newborns where the first sound they learned from a father's house was your hurt. You decide if they grow up hearing something different." For a long moment, Maggie did not move. The babies shifted against her, 3 small bodies pressed to the broad shelf of her chest, tiny mouths searching even in sleep. The yard was silent, except for their soft snuffles and the creak of the neighbor's gate as someone leaned in to hear better. All her life, she had been told a woman stayed where she was put, on this dirt, in this house, under this man's temper. Now a stranger built like a barn door was offering her the one thing she had never been given: a way out. Carl snarled, "You're not going anywhere, Maggie. You belong here. Those brats, too." She looked up at him then, really looked, and saw not a husband but a man more afraid of talk than of God. Her cheek throbbed, her ribs complained with every breath. Her arms ached from holding 3 squirming bundles, And yet she felt something rise in her that was stronger than all of it, the same stubborn thread that had carried her through 3 little funerals and 1 long night of birth. "I belong to the Lord," she said quietly. "And to these babies. You just happen to share the roof." Jonah's mouth twitched at that, the bare ghost of a smile. He stepped back from her porch so she could stand if she chose to. He did not reach for her. He only waited, massive and steady, as if he was a door that would stay open a while, but not forever. Maggie drew a slow breath. "If I go," she asked, "will you come after me, Carl? Bring your fists up that mountain." He shifted from foot to foot and spat in the dust to buy time. "Man has a right to his wife," he muttered. "Preacher will say so." "Preacher will also see these marks," she answered, touching her swollen cheek with one big rough hand. "He will see 3 newborns you left on a step while you sat in the saloon. You want that talk at every stove in Willow Ford." The neighbor woman at the fence gave a short hum of agreement she did not bother to hide. Somewhere down the lane, a door shut and another opened. Maggie realized the town might not fight for her, but it would not hide what it had seen either. Shame moved over Carl's face, quick and sour. "You walk out that gate," he snapped. "Don't you come back." She looked down at the 3 small faces tucked in her arms and in the crate. "That," she said, "was the first kind thing you have said this week." She stood up, slow and careful, every part of her protesting. Her body was large, solid, made for work and for carrying weight. And now she used that strength to gather what little she owned. 1 small sack with 2 dresses, a worn Bible, the quilt her mother had pieced before she died, faded but still warm. She looped the strap of the sack across her chest, bent, and hooked the crate's handle with 1 broad hand, settling the 3rd baby more secure. 3 tiny heads rested along her collarbone and against her shoulder like a row of fragile birds. "I am ready," she said. Jonah moved then, taking the crate gently from her hand, so her overtaxed body did not have to bear all of it. Up close, his size was even more startling. His arm next to hers looked like a tree trunk beside a fence rail. Yet his grip on the box was careful, as if he carried glass. As they walked out through the gate, Carl shouted after them, "He killed a man up there, you know. Ask around. That's who you're running to." Jonah paused, but did not turn. "I buried a man," he said. "One who thought my late wife's face was his to touch when I was gone. The sheriff called it self-defense. Your kind called it a story to whisper. Believe whichever version lets you sleep, Jessup." Maggie glanced sideways at him, heart beating fast for a different reason now. "You had a wife," she said softly as they reached the wagon. "Yes," he answered, "and a baby on the way. Fever took them both before I could get them off the ridge. That was 6 winters back. I have not shared my roof since." He set the crate in the nest of blankets he had laid in the wagon bed and checked each baby with a glance that missed nothing. "Does not sit right with me," he added, "to see another woman punished for doing what mine never got the chance to finish." He helped her climb up, big hands circling her waist for a moment, lifting her like she weighed less than a grain sack. She settled on the seat, every bruise waking as she sat, but there was air in her lungs she had not felt in days. 3 little cries rose, then fell as the wagon rocked and the motion soothed them. As Jonah climbed up beside her and took the reins, Willow Ford watched from doorways and windows. Some saw a scandal, some saw a rescue. The neighbor woman at the fence saw a battered girl walking out with her head as high as her hurt would let it go, and a giant with his shoulders set like a man walking into a job he meant to finish. Mountain's no easy place, Maggie said as the town fell behind them. They say men disappear up there. Men who go up with bad hearts, maybe, Jonah replied. The mountain has no use for those, but it has room for folks who know how to work and hold on. He gave her a sideways look. You carried 3 at once through a storm, and you are still upright. I reckon you and that ridge will get on fine. The road began to climb, each turn taking them farther from the church spire and the crooked boardwalk and the man on the porch who had chosen his pride over his family. Ahead lay dark pines and the thin blue smoke from a chimney Maggie had never seen. One life behind, another waiting somewhere above the tree line, with a man no one dared cross, and 3 babies who knew only the sound of their mother's heart and the creak of a wagon starting up a mountain road. The climb to Jonah Hale's place took the rest of that day and a good piece of the next, the wagon tracing narrow ledges and winding through dark patches of pine where the air smelled like cold and sap. Each turn took Willow Ford further away until it lay behind them like a story that had already ended, the kind people tell in low voices and then shake their heads over. Maggie held her babies close and watched the land change. Brown hills giving way to rock and shadow, the sky opening wide in a way it never had above the little church and the crooked boardwalk. When they finally turned into a small clearing near the shoulder of Breakneck Ridge, she understood why they called him a mountain man. His cabin sat with its back to a wall of gray stone, logs fitted tight, roof low against the wind, smoke curling from a rock chimney. There was a shed for tools, a lean-to for firewood stacked neat, and a corral with 1 mule and a couple of tough-looking cows. This was not a place for show. It was a place built by 2 big hands that meant to stay. Jonah stopped the team, and for a moment they just sat, listening to the quiet. No saloon piano, no church bell, only the whisper of the pines and the faint creak of leather as the horses shifted. The babies made small questioning sounds, their whole world now reduced to cold air, new smells and the steady presence of 2 hearts that would decide everything for them. He climbed down first and lifted the crate of sleeping babies as if it was the most important cargo he had ever carried, which in his heart it was. Then he turned and held up his arms for her, big scarred hands open and sure. She hesitated only a breath before letting him take her weight. He settled her on her feet, and for the first time she saw how his door frame barely cleared the top of his head. Inside the cabin, the air was warm from a banked fire. The room was one big square, bed along one wall, table under the front window, shelves lined with jars and sacks, a rocking chair in the corner that looked like it had not been used in years. Faint marks on the floor showed where a cradle had once stood. There was no lace, no fancy curtains, just solid boards and things that worked. It felt like standing inside a palm, rough but steady. Jonah set the crate on the bed and stepped back so she could gather her babies. He busied himself at the stove, stirring something that smelled like stew, the simple motion of a man who had long since learned to feed himself and had not expected to cook for more than one ever again. "You can take the bed," he said after a while, his deep voice softer in the close space. "I roll out here by the fire. That table there is yours to clutter. Those shelves, too. Only thing I ask is you tell me when something's running low so a man can plan." Maggie nodded, throat tight. He talked about space and flour and planning like this was the most ordinary arrangement in the world, like women and babies rode up this ridge every week. She knew it was not so. She could feel the strangeness of it in the way he moved, careful not to crowd her, giving her room in a cabin that had never been built with room in mind. The first hours were a blur of small needs. She changed linen with hands that shook from the climb and from all the days before. She fed one baby and then the next, and then the third, her big arms forming a circle that somehow always found space for all three. Jonah chopped wood just outside the door until the sky went purple, his axe thudding a steady rhythm, a promise that heat would not be the thing that failed them. That night when the wind rose and combed its fingers across the roof, the old fear tried to crawl back into her chest, the fear that some curse had brought these children and would now take them. But each time it swelled, one of the babies stirred, and she would bend and press her cheek to a tiny, warm back, and remember the look on Carl's face when the wagon rolled away. How his rage had been rooted not in love, but in wounded pride and hunger for what people thought. Her fear shifted then. Not gone, but changed. It became a careful watchfulness instead of a thing that owned her. In the quiet, Jonah sat by the fire and watched too, his eyes going now and then to the worn bit of ribbon tacked over the mantel, a faded scrap from the dress his first wife had worn the day they climbed this same hill, with plans for a lifetime. Fever had taken that ribbon down along with the woman and the child she carried, yet he had never brought himself to throw it away. Now, in the flicker of the flames, he saw that old grief and the new sight of a broad-shouldered woman bent over 3 small bundles, and something in him eased that had been clenched tight for 6 hard years. He did not speak of it. He only rose once in the deep night when one of the babies cried sharper than before. He crossed the room on quiet feet, checked the stove, added a log, and stood for a long moment watching Maggie sleep, sitting up, back against the wall. Arms full of life, she refused to surrender, her face bruised, but peaceful in a way it had not been on that front step in Willow Ford. Up on that ridge, under a sky cold and clear enough to spill stars into the chimney smoke, a cabin built for one took its first slow breath as a house for 4. And the giant mountain man and the woman with 3 babies, too many, began learning how to share the same small patch of light in a land that did not often make room for second chances. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm no one in Willow Ford would have believed. Dawn came pale over Breakneck Ridge, and Maggie was already awake, moving slow but steady through the little cabin. 3 tiny mouths to feed, 3 sets of wriggling legs to wrap, 3 sleepy heads to tuck into the big box Jonah had turned into a cradle by lining it with rabbit fur and old flannel. Outside, the giant mountain man split wood and checked traps and looked in the door more often than he used to look in any door at all. There were days when the work felt like a long climb with no plateau in sight. On one gray morning, 2 babies cried at once, and the third started in just to keep them even. Maggie's body still healing, her big hands shaking as she tried to hold bottles and shift blankets. She laughed once, in a short, raw way that was closer to a sob. "I cannot do this," she blurted, voice breaking. "I am only one woman, Jonah. I am going to fail them. Maybe if we found a family in town for one of them, a good family with more money, more milk, maybe that would be kinder than watching me drop from my feet." The words tore out before she could stop them, and the moment they were in the air, she wanted to claw them back. Jonah stood in the doorway, filling it the way he always did, snow still on his shoulders. He looked from her tear-streaked face to the 3 red little ones, and his own expression went fierce in a quiet way. "No," he said, just that one word first, solid as the ridge behind him. Then he came in and crouched down so his big frame was level with her tired eyes. "You listen to me, Maggie Lane. You carried all 3 of them through a storm and out of a house where a man's hand landed quicker than his thanks. There is not a soul on this mountain or down in Willow Ford that is going to slice this little army apart to make life neater. They came here as 3, they stay here as 3. You are not failing them. You are just tired to the bone. There is a difference." He reached for one baby, huge hands somehow managing to cradle that tiny body without swallowing it up. The child quieted almost at once, staring up at him like those gray eyes had been the plan from the start. He handed another to Maggie and settled the 3rd in the crook of his arm. Suddenly, the noise did not seem so big when it was split between 4 shoulders instead of 1. They rocked in an uneven little rhythm by the stove. Big man, big woman, 3 very small people. And the thought of giving one away shrank to the size it really was. A fear born of exhaustion, not truth. Spring pushed its way up the slope by inches, snow pulling back from rocks, little bursts of green showing along the creek that ran behind the cabin. Jonah carried 2 of the babies at a time out to feel the sun on their faces. Maggie followed with the 3rd and laughed for real when a fat little hand batted at a dust mote and missed. These were not curses. They were just hungry and loud and very alive. The kind of trouble a heart could live on. Word from town came up the ridge with the mail wagon once a month. The driver brought flour and coffee and carried back stories. He said the talk in Willow Ford had changed its tune. The first version had been that Jonah Hale had stolen another man's wife. The second that Maggie had run off with the killer on the mountain. But then the preacher had quietly asked Carl Jessup why his wife had had to leave with one eye closed and 3 infants in her arms. Neighbors had stepped forward with what they had seen. The beating, the drinking, the neglect. And the story had shifted just a bit more toward the truth. One afternoon, late in the summer when the triplets were big enough to roll and laugh and grab at Jonah's beard, a rider came up the track, dust on his coat and Bible in his saddlebag. It was the preacher from Willow Ford, his horse sweating from the climb. He took off his hat and stood at the fence while Jonah watched from the woodpile, and Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and came to the door, a baby perched on one hip, like he had always lived there. "I came to see if you are safe," the preacher said, looking more at her than at Jonah. "And if you mean to remain as you are." Maggie shifted the baby and met his gaze head-on, bruises long since faded, shoulders still broad and steady. "I am safer than I ever was in town, Reverend. And as for remaining as I am, I reckon that is up to the Lord, and to the man who shares this roof, not to folks who never once stopped by when my face was purple and my ribs hurt to breathe." The preacher flushed, whether from shame or from the thin air it was hard to say. He looked at the 3 small heads bobbing just inside the door, another on a blanket by the hearth, and something gentler moved over his features. "Children born together used to frighten people," he admitted. "But I have been reading my own book again, and I do not find any curses written over triplets." He turned to Jonah. "You intend to make this right in the eyes of the church." Jonah straightened to his full height, wiped his hands, and came to stand beside Maggie, so their shoulders nearly touched. "Reverend, there is room at that little church for a wedding if you have a mind to ride back up here again. But as far as I am concerned, I made it right the day I hitched my team and told Willow Ford those 4 lives mattered more than gossip." In the end, they were married up on the ridge under a sky the color of deep water. Just the preacher, the wagon driver. 3 babies who fussed through the vows, and the wind carrying their promises down the valley. Willow Ford still talked, towns always do, but over the years the edge went out of the stories. Folks started saying that the woman they once beat for bringing too much life into a hard land had become the heart of a high country homestead, that the giant on Breakneck Ridge could carry a whole elk on his shoulders and 3 toddlers at once if he had to, and that if you climbed high enough on a clear morning, you could hear them all laughing together on the porch. My dear friend, if this tale of a bruised mother, her 3 little curses, turned blessings, and the giant mountain man who said, "You're coming with me," warmed your heart tonight, I would be so glad if you left a like on this story and subscribed to the channel, so we can keep sharing many more tales from the Wild West together under this wide western sky.